Stretching out across the land, and I'm trying my best to understand, while fear is barking like a dog, and I'm holding out my hands, still holding out my hands, 'cause hope is coming out tonight, yeah, knocking at the door.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start proceedings. You're all very welcome to Queen's University, and we're delighted that Queen's University are hosting our first Imagine Festival. We have one tomorrow night in Ulster University, so we share universities. So that's on checks and balances, the role of opposition in the future. But I'm delighted on behalf of the John Hume Foundation to welcome you here today. I know it's been a difficult week in terms of the murders of a number of women and the trial of Natalie, and I know Aishling will speak about that in a few minutes, but obviously we want to acknowledge that in the last week it's been very difficult, and it's very topical given the conversation we're going to have around the impact of social media abuse towards women in politics. But also it's important to reflect, as somebody who's a Queen's University graduate, who was president of Students' Union 1987-88, you know, we knew as a youngster in Northern Ireland and at Queen's University the consequences of violence during the Troubles. And there was many political representatives across the island of different political families and traditions who faced threats, abuse and direct murderous attacks at that time. And a number of political representatives across the island were murdered. And I remember when I was a first year in 1983, turning the corner from Botanic Avenue, and about 50 minutes earlier, Edgar Green, the academic at Queen's University and a member of the Ulster Unionist Party, had been murdered by the IRA, which was traumatic for his family, but for the university family as a whole. He was talking to David Trimble only a few minutes beforehand, and David Trimble always said if Edgar Graham had survived, he would have been maybe the modern leader of Ulster Unionism at the time. So we know the consequences. Later on, as president of the Students' Union, I was here when Maria Farrell was murdered, and also in 2002, Sheena Campbell was murdered in the York Hotel in Botanic Avenue. So we know in the darkest days of the Troubles, the consequences of violence. Again, violence against women, in a number of those instances, but the consequence and the threat to democracy and constitutionalism that was held at that time. So it's important to remember that. And we've come a long way since then with the Good Friday Agreement and the relative peace we have today. But it is pretty shocking when you see the stacks, and our speakers will comment about that today, about the real and present dangers that we face today, especially for political representatives, for women in society especially. And obviously, we're delighted that Hannah's here from Jo Cox Foundation. And it's 10 years since Jo was murdered in June this year. I know there's a plan for an event, hopefully in Stormont as well, around a get-together. And obviously, it's 5 years in October when David Amos was murdered. So again, after coming through the trauma of the Troubles, we saw a political representative was murdered in the UK. And there is political representatives from across the divide, and especially women, who are facing extreme attack, and that attack defends politics and the vitriol that they're facing, we'll be talking about tonight. But it's horrific that we, after what we came through, have an agreement that we're now talking about the real, clear and present danger to women in politics today. John Hume, obviously, he always promoted a more ethical discourse, and he said, difference is an accident of birth, and it should therefore be the source of hate. Should never be the source of hatred or conflict. The answer to different is respected. And obviously that's something that we as a Hume Foundation try to continue that journey today and promoting that. I'd like to thank Queen's University for hosting this event, and I'd like to thank the speakers for attending. Can I now call on Queen's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Ian Greer, to give a welcome on behalf of Queen's University.
Oh, thank you, Tim. It's great to join you this evening. and welcome you to this very important event, the democratic impact of social media abuse towards women in politics. This is part of this year's Imagine Festival, and it's an event organised by the John and Pat Hume Foundation, as you've heard from Tim. The Foundation believes that respectful debate between competing ideas is an essential and indeed a healthy feature of public discourse in free societies. The Foundation launched a campaign in 2024 to promote respectful and ethical political discourse, to inspire confidence in political process and to further reconciliation and democracy. That work was inspired by the Jo Cox Foundation, addressing the problem of violence, abuse and intimidation of elected representatives at all levels. So I offer my thanks to the organisers and indeed our panellists for bringing us together this evening to discuss this important issue. Now, social media has reshaped the landscape of political communication. It's enabled politicians to communicate directly with citizens in ways we couldn't previously imagine. However, alongside these opportunities, we've seen the emergence of hostility, of harassment and violence. Further, that level of abuse, especially through digital media and AI, is gendered and has a serious impact on women's ability to fully and freely participate in politics. There are too many examples of female elected representatives who've bravely spoken out about the scale and intensity of the online abuse, which is often threatening and with a clear undertone of misogyny. Many have been leading efforts to challenge this culture, working to ensure that no one in public life has to endure such abuse simply for doing their job. But unfortunately, this online abuse is not an isolated issue. By way of example, research by Dr. Michelle Butler here in Queen's for the Young Life and Time survey highlighted the prevalence of gender-based abuse in 16-year-olds, with around half of female respondents reporting gender-based violence in the previous year. Many of these incidents occurred online or in school settings. Research led by Siobhan McAllister here in Queen's has highlighted that 73% of girls aged between 12 and 17 report at least one experience of violence in their lifetime. So it's clear that the abuse that women and girls face online and offline reflects a deep and widespread societal problem. This is simply unacceptable and demands a strong and collective response, a response that not only condemns such behaviour, but also works to prevent it, to support those affected, and of course holds the perpetrators to account. Events like this bring together many perspectives to discuss these important issues. So I'm looking forward to the discussion with the excellent panellists this evening. The panellists include Hannah Phillips from the Jo Cox Foundation, Nóirín O'Sullivan, Chair of Fair Participation in Public Life, and Cara Hunter, MLA. And the event is chaired by Aishling Morrow from Queen's, an expert on gender, security and terrorism. So in closing, can I again thank all our speakers and organisers for creating such a valuable event. And I'll now hand you back to Tim from the John and Pat Hume Foundation.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for those generous words. Just one addendum. Dawn Purvis, who's the Vice Chair of the Hume Foundation, unfortunately is sick tonight, so she can't join us, which is a real pity, because obviously she's tied to the Hume Foundation, but she was an MLA for many years and she had a lot to offer tonight. But we have an excellent panel, which means you've got more time to be given and to be grilled maybe by the audience as well. So can I pass over to Aishling now, who's going to chair tonight's event. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Tim, and thank you to our Vice-Chancellor for his introduction also. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome everyone here today. I just wish that the Belfast weather had been slightly more welcoming, so well done on braving this terrible evening, and thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I want to flag that some of the topics we discuss tonight will be distressing and will be upsetting. So if anybody needs at any stage to take a break and leave the room, that is perfectly acceptable to do so. Additionally, at the end of the discussion, I'm going to highlight some resources available. So if anyone's affected by the discussion, they will be available to you also. And as Tim spoke about and linked to this, I think it's really important to highlight and contextualize the broader context of tonight's discussion. So at the weekend, we saw the 30th woman murdered violently in Northern Ireland. And out of those 30 women, all but one were killed by men, or there is a man awaiting trial. The vast majority of those women were also killed in their own homes. And that statistic does not include the children that have also been murdered in Northern Ireland. And I think what we'll be discussing today, the democratic impact of social media abuse towards women, is a huge element of the violence against women and girls that we witness in today's society. And earlier in our mini panel, we were discussing the kind of importance of early warning signs. And one of the clear signs of a healthy and peaceful society is how its women are treated. So all of our panelists here tonight, which I'm going to introduce, are at the forefront of challenging this form of abuse. But sadly, that positioning has also made them targets for abuse too. And so to start and move up, our panelists tonight are Cara Hunter. And Cara, as many of you will know, is an SDLP MLA for East Derry. And I also believe the youngest ever MLA, so a history maker. But Cara was actually targeted in 2022 with a pornographic deep fake. And I think what's really important to focus on is how that experience has led you to advocate for support for those affected by technology-facilitated gender-based abuse. And that has translated into a Churchill Fellowship, where you're focusing on the impact of AI harm, the UK democracy, and female political participation. Secondly, we have Nóirín O'Sullivan, who is an executive leader with over 40 years of public sector experience. Another history maker, as Nóirín was the first ever female commissioner to lead Ireland's National Policing and Security Service on Garda Síochána. Furthermore, Nóirín has also previously been appointed the United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Safety and Security, and most recently, she has chaired the Oireachtas Cross-Party Task Force on Safe Participation in Political Life. And that report and its recommendations is one of the topics that we're going to discuss tonight. And then finally, we have Hannah Phillips. And Hannah Phillips is a Respectful Politics policy manager as part of the Jo Cox Foundation. So Hannah is a policy professional and researcher, and she promotes civility and gender equality in public life. Hannah has over a decade of experience in the public sector and academia, and her unique background spans local, national, and international policy. So Hannah has significant experience advising and implementing strategic priorities, including at the United Nations and the UK House of Commons. So we're going to open today with Hannah, and she's going to reflect on the recently published renewed call to action to address abuse in politics in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So Hannah, this call to action was a follow-up from the initial call to action in 2024, and it was specifically focusing on the devolved nations. I suppose to start off, what was the thinking behind the report and specifically some of the core issues raised in relation to devolved nations?
Yes, absolutely. I think I kind of want to start with just setting the context of the Jo Cox Foundation, just in case people are not familiar with us. So we were set up nearly 10 years ago after Jo Cox MP was murdered on the way to her constituency advice surgery by a white supremacist. And Jo's friends and family set up the foundation to create positive change and kind of a positive vision of Jo's legacy. And what our kind of umbrella for all of our work is Jo's message that we have more in common than that which divides us. I'd recommend watching her full maiden speech, their first speech in Parliament, but that's a key message that informs all of our work. And we work in two main areas: empowering stronger communities and championing respectful politics. And for the last few years, the core part of our respectful politics work has been the Jo Cox Foundation Commission, which creates recommendations and crucially works on the implementation of recommendations to address this growing problem of abuse, violence, harassment, intimidation towards elected representatives and candidates on all levels of government across the UK. And we released our first report back in 2024 with a range of recommendations for across the political ecosystem, so political parties, parliaments, curriculum change, the police. We really had a kind of broad overview, and we created these recommendations in collaboration with academics, civil society, members themselves, and we had a really good engagement after that last report and saw some really good progress, particularly in terms of policing and security. So, for example, Westminster Parliament now has specific advice for families of MPs, which was something that was coming up a lot in terms of there was really good advice, particularly after the tragic murders of Jo and then Sir David Amess, really improved security advice and guidance for members themselves. But that kind of wider impact on staff and families has now been taken more seriously. And there's also now a specific police support for local councillors and representatives, which it is sad that we've got to the point where that is seen as necessary, but it is a really important policy change. And as we were kind of working through the implementation, a lot of our colleagues in the devolved nations, I'm originally from Scotland, that's not why we did it, but it helped, really wanted something a bit more specific that they could really implement in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So it was kind of feedback we got kind of after that initial report to work more specifically. And again, we followed kind of similar themes in terms of making it as holistic as possible in terms of kind of various parts of the whole political ecosystem. And what became really clear is I was expecting there to be perhaps some more differences about the problem or about what needed to happen, but over and over, like all the discussions I had, Cara was very helpful when we were developing these recommendations, members of Scottish Parliament and the Senate, like really clear themes, and particularly the kind of impact on women members and the range of different abuse. So online abuse, in-person abuse, often a combination of abuse experienced online then affecting, kind of spilling out into the offline world or vice versa. So that was something that came across really like across the whole of the UK and indeed beyond. And I think what's really important, kind of as we kind of highlighted so far, is this kind of abuse towards people in public life really reflects the broader like power inequalities in society. It's not surprising that the abuse that people in public life face follows that kind of gendered race and so on, like the phenomenon of that. And something that's been really interesting, alarming, important in the last few years is there has been a lot more research done, not just kind of internationally, but also national level and in the devolved nations as well. So we have a real strong evidence base of not just the problem, but the impact. And a couple of stats that always stand out to me in terms of the impact is one in the 2024 general election, the UK Electoral Commission surveyed candidates, and over half of the candidates who responded to the survey said that they had avoided certain political activities because of, not necessarily that they had experienced abuse, but because they feared that they might. So they might not participate in hustings, they might not have talked about certain policy issues, and that has a really important chilling effect on our democracy. So that's something I think, and we have a lot more research on that as well, but that always stands out to me. And in terms of the impact on people who might want to run for office, Girl Guiding did a survey, and it was over a third of girls and young women were put off certain high-profile careers, including politics, specifically because of the abuse they saw women get online. And again, that's really detrimental for our democracy, because this problem disproportionately impacts those who are already underrepresented. And if we want a kind of functioning representative democracy, we really have to tackle this issue. Another kind of more hopeful point of view is there is a lot of good work happening across the UK. So, for example, here in Northern Ireland, the PSNI and Stormont have been working on the MLA safety strategy, which has been rolling out so that MLAs know what support is out there. They're also rolling that out to councillors. Again, that's really important. We're supporting calls for the gender-sensitive audit of the Assembly, and safety will be part of that. And so really our work is coming at a very good time, a time in which there is a good momentum around this issue, and there are a lot of different aspects of the political ecosystem really working on this. And yeah, we really have to keep that kind of momentum up in terms of implementation. And this is a shared issue internationally, and there are a lot of people working on this, and it's really great to be in this room where we're kind of talking about, not just what can be done, but how we can amplify and extend what's already happening. And, all these kind of individual policy areas are really, really important. And I think what we need to be really clear on is that we need kind of system-wide culture change to address, all the various parts of this problem: abuse towards people in public life, abuse towards women, social media, understanding why this is all happening and how they all interlink. And I guess to end then the first bit on a hopeful note, we really believe in a kind of vision of politics and society in which we, with coming back to Jo's message, that we can, debate robustly, respectfully, and, have a vision that we have more in common than that which divides us.
Great, excellent. It's always nice to hear a positive, hopeful tone. And so the one thing I really enjoyed about the report was that it linked with the Oireachtas task force recommendations, but also it linked with your experience, Cara, on the ground as a politician. And so for the panel in general, we're kind of witnessing, not to bring a negative tone, but we're witnessing a new form of democratic backsliding where women are having to choose between their own personal safety and getting involved in politics at whatever level. And I know, Hannah, you spoke about the different measures that are being brought in place, and especially that kind of expanded funding around safety and policing. But Nóirín, in the Oireachtas report, it really highlighted the kind of stark realities for ethnic minorities, specifically in Ireland for the traveller community, but also the LGBTQ plus community, and then women in general. Just an easy question to start off with. What is the solution to this new form of democratic backsliding?
I think, firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much. Thank you to the Queen's University. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Tim, because I do think what Hannah has just said, it's really important. And thank you, most of all, to all of the attendees for attending, because I think we should never underestimate the power of every single one of us in dealing with this issue and with the broader issues that we are going to discuss tonight, because it's really important that we amplify it and that we make this a conversation that carries on, because a lot of really good work is underway, a lot of good work has been done. But as you've just said, Aishling, I think there is a lot of backsliding, and we see it right across the world with the messages, not just about women, but actually about how important democracy is and the international rules and law and order. And I think it's really important that we as a collective and we as society actually start to talk about these things. And no more important to my heart than actually a representation of women and minorities, because if we are talking about democracy and democratic resilience, it is about having everybody's voices heard. And it's about, back to what Tim said about John Hume, it's about having respectful debate and accountability, but doing it in a way that actually allows everybody's voice and everybody's perspective to be heard. So I think it really, really is important. And I'd be a very rich woman, actually, if I could answer very succinctly that question. But actually, I do think it's everybody's business. And I think there's certain, I can talk about the task force report and the implementation that needs to happen. But actually, it also needs to happen in society. So for me, it's from top down and from bottom up. And actually, for me, I would reverse that, because the bottom is actually with schools and communities. But actually, that actually is the top, because that's where we're going to change behaviours and change culture. And actually, when we have schools and communities that actually can meet with difference, respect difference, and actually come together to solve problems, for me, that's actually some of the solution. That's where it starts. And then for that to permeate upwards into the chambers where people meet, into parties. And I see all the time, and I hear stories all the time from people, not just people who want to go into politics, but people who want to be active in their communities, people that want to raise issues within their own communities, people who want to be activists for things that they really believe in, and how their voices have been silenced from what they're experiencing in situations like Cara and others, and how that's actually causing, it's more than a chilling effect. For me, it's very sinister, because people's voices can be blocked out and people's real passions and beliefs and the real problems that they have. And, Tim referenced some of the reports that were done previously around paramilitarism and violence, and we certainly have experience of that in the South as well, and even in terms of organised crime and the impact. But actually, if people in communities can't be heard and can't voice their voices, that's a real problem for democracy, and it's a real problem for a safe and inclusive society, which is what we should all aspire to. We should aspire to be able to work together, to live together, and to have our representation make its way all to our chambers and through our local councils and our local government, and to be able to have that participation. And certainly in my experience, what I see is women and minority groups who actually don't want to stand, not just for office, but actually they're afraid to actually stand up and represent their communities or represent their communities' interests. And that's a really, really it's more than a backslide. That actually undermines democracy in the most fundamental way. If we can't have people who can come and feel safe, and I would like to emphasise something that Hannah said, there's the threats of violence, there's the perpetration of violence, and there is the horrible, egregious things that happen to people. But actually, one thing that I've experienced over the years, when people feel afraid, that's when silence prevails. And that's when that vacuum is created, when the other side can have their voices amplified and can actually spread hatred and difference and divide. And I think that's what we all need to start working against. I could talk about this forever, Aishling, so I'm going to stop. But I really think it's really important that we do, and I would ask that everybody that's taken the time to come here tonight leaves, I hope, feeling a little bit incentivised to go and have your voice heard and to actually speak up. Because one of the things also, and I can speak to this from personal experience as well as from the evidence we took before the task force, some of the most traumatic things that have happened to people actually are when others don't speak up. And that saying, bad things happen when good people don't speak up. And I think that's something that actually really resonates with me. When nobody says stop or hold or asks questions. And I'm not just talking about we as individual people, but as journalists, as professors in academia, right across the spectrum, when people aren't actually calling things out and calling for it to stop, that's when we really, really have a problem. But I'm also an optimist, so I do like to think that actually the more that we can come together, and I like to call it the coalition of the willing, although that's a very bad phrase to use at the moment if we look at what's happening across the Atlantic. So actually I'm going to have to think of a new phrase because we are going to, but I do think it's when good people come together and amplify our voices as opposed to allowing the voices of those that want to sow that hatred and that division, and to stop good people from representing their communities, because that's what this is about. And what you see in the South, and I know it's happening here in the North as well, and indeed across all of the devolved parliaments, when you see good people stepping away from politics because they feel that not alone are they under threat, but that their families are under threat, or indeed their staff are under threat, that's a very, very serious issue for democracy.
We're going to trademark Coalition of the Willing for Nóirín and take it back. And I really enjoy the kind of optimism as well, and I think it mirrors what's in the report from the Jo Cox Foundation, that cultural change is possible and that we all play a part in that. And I think that's a really important message if there's only one message to take away from today. And Cara, I want to speak to you also about the level of abuse that you've experienced. And you were targeted, as we said at the start, by a pornographic deepfake in 2022. And research has shown that 96% of all deepfakes are pornographic in nature. And of that 96%, 99% of those involve women. So there's a clear strategy here. In the context of NI and also your own experience where violence against women and girls is so deeply embedded in society, firstly reflecting on your own experience and how you've turned that into something positive, how can we work to make political life a safe space for women and girls?
Well, it's a fantastic question, and I'd just like to start by saying thank you so much to everyone who has joined here tonight. We're like sisters in arms across this panel, working across these islands to do the right thing and to support women in these positions. So it's really heartwarming for me to be here tonight with yourselves. I think ultimately, if we strip back tech-facilitated gender-based harm, ultimately it's all about silencing women. And I think there really is, in Northern Ireland, we're post-conflict, the misogyny here is unbelievably rife. the level of violence against women and girls is palpable, it's evident. It is an unbelievably hard place to be seen and to be heard in politics. And certainly in my experience, it was absolutely soul-crushing. To this day, I've talked at length about with tech-facilitated harm, you will never know the true extent of the harm, how many people have seen this, how many people have believed it. And I think what we've seen, particularly with encrypted platforms like WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, the origin of this false content is impossible to get access to. And that furthers your shame, and you have to fight so hard with tech tools to evidence your innocence. And I just felt like, oh my goodness, if I'm a person in a position of power and I am struggling with this much embarrassment and shame, what must it be like for girls right across Northern Ireland in our schools, young children who are being blackmailed with completely false AI-generated images? And recently I had spoken up about Grok, which is on Elon Musk's X platform, formerly known as Twitter. And following speaking up about that, I had this is in the past few weeks, my Assembly email address, so my Northern Ireland Assembly email address used to sign up to 3 pornographic websites. And the username that was used by whoever had done this was extremely derogatory towards myself, and it just feels never ending. And I would say in Northern Irish politics, there is a sense of hypervigilance, particularly for women, because it almost feels as though you're waiting for the ball to drop. And when this experience happened to myself and DUP's Diane Forsyth, other female members said, I just feel like is it me next? You know, there is this weight, this sense of, because we're women, the best tool to shame a woman in this society is sexuality. You know, all these false images strip you. They make you feel exposed, even though they're entirely fake. And I just felt this great, overwhelming sense of injustice. I still do to this day, which has really driven me on not a woe is me campaign, but I want more women in politics, and I want the daughters, you know, generations to come to know that this is a place for them. And it just felt, you know, I'm still angered by it to this day, that there is a level of anonymity afforded to the people. At the click of a button, you can start the most horrendous rumour, and it's extremely painful. So I really think that's why I welcome being here tonight and hearing the level of work being done with the Jo Cox Foundation. The PSNI, in my experience now, with the Assembly and the moves that have been made, it is far superior. It's such, honestly, it is so heartwarming to see the changes. People are taking violence against women and girls in public life that bit more seriously. And I find that really welcome, because you're almost holding your breath every time you go to your phone. And one memory that really sticks out to me being in public life was I first got into politics in 2019. And I went to America with a UUP councillor, a gentleman, his name is Alan Lewis. And we were both putting up online, it's brilliant to be here today. I've talked about this issue in my community. We're bringing back questions, solutions and answers to problems in our communities. And we were putting up almost word for word the exact same content. And he was like, that looks brilliant, put that up. And I thought, yeah, this is great. Now he was putting it up and everyone was, great job, Alan, standing up for our community, good man yourself. The news was carrying him, but it was a different story when I had done it. You're a poser, my God, your makeup, what are you doing over there? There was no sense of equality. 2 people doing the exact same job, one being targeted for really no other reason than just being a young woman. And I have to say, the job at the start was incredibly isolating, because you're chatting with your older male colleagues who have been in this job for years and years, and you're trying to say, hey, you know, is this normal? And they're saying, oh, it's all part of the job, but the nature of it is highly sexualized and extremely degrading. So for me, I think the core goal here, through the research that I'm currently conducting, I have a meeting with the E-Safety Commissioner of Australia, and we've seen just how forward-thinking they've been, how energetic they've been, how transformative they've been in the online space. So really looking forward to speaking what they're doing on AI and AI harms, because we can't continue to live like this, and we've already seen in Northern Ireland children being blackmailed, and we have to do better.
Yeah, great. And I think as well, it's important to realise that this misogyny and this sexualised violence is strategic, and it's about keeping women out of politics, and it's about spreading the both real and perceived threat towards these women, but also that misogyny is profitable, right? And these tech giants are making huge profits. And also the perpetrators of these deepfakes are making huge profits out of what is created. And it's not just elected officials, it's also down south. We've had serious problems with teachers being subjected to pornographic deepfakes. And so, Nóirín, in the Oireachtas report, the task force, one of the core recommendations is that political parties need to take seriously what's happening to women in politics and need to do more work in terms of protecting women in politics. Can you reflect on how you feel about political parties? Have they taken that on board? Have you seen real differences, or has that been slow to translate?
I think, to be honest, it's slow to translate. I think implementation, as Hannah referenced earlier, is a real problem. And in some cases, not because people don't take it seriously, but I think no matter what roadmap you give, actually there's not always, a priority to actually implementing it. And, listening to Cara's experience, I have to say, I'm just reminded of the traumatic effect that has on individual people. And then political parties, we had this conversation when we were going through the task force. Political parties aren't the employers, so they don't see themselves as they have a duty of care. So actually that kind of, if you like, exonerates political parties, and I'm speaking in a general way, from actually having to have any duty of care to the person. However, Cara or others decide they're going to stand for a specific political party. And even as regards pathways for reporting. So sometimes when this happens, it's very traumatic. And I'm reminded of Giselle Pelko, and I will bring that in for a moment, because actually when the victim, and I know some elected representatives particularly don't like to hear themselves being called victims, but actually any of us that have been subjected to something like that are victims, irrespective of what office we hold. But where the victim has to take the burden of getting in touch with the telco, being able to actually report this and everything else without any supports in place, that's a huge toll on the individual. It's an additional toll as well as the abuse itself. And it's also a huge toll on their staff. And one thing that really resonated with me, and I will come to the political parties at the moment, because individual members are employing individual people as their staff members. In some cases, they may be family members, extended family members, or the people from the local community. And they're manning offices. They're also manning the social media profiles of individuals. And one of the things that really struck me about some of the evidence we heard before the Oireachtas was the level of misogynistic, xenophobic, absolutely vile abuse that people have had to sift through and try to protect their principle from seeing themselves so it won't disturb them. The impact that has on the staff member is absolutely huge. And impact is a really important word, but it's a word we all use very lightly. But impact has lasting effects and consequences. And when it comes to political parties, I think there's a lot more can be done. I think there's a lot more can be done to have safe pathways for reporting, because a lot of people feel, and I'll use a quote from the Oireachtas Task Force report, and this was an actual quote from somebody, if I report that, it means I can't take the heat, so get out of the kitchen. And that's not good enough. Here we are in 2026, and people should accept or be expected to accept abuse in their workplace, because it is their workplace. And when people talk about democracy again, and I will for a moment, because when people have the courage to speak, to stand up and to serve, you would expect that they will be respected and supported in doing that, even if they have a different point of view. And it absolutely violently different, sorry, violence, not a good word either, but an absolutely vehemently opposed point of view. But actually, that's not what's happening. And, and the other thing that we found, and to be frank, in some cases the abuse was coming from within political parties themselves. And it wasn't always coming from the party next door across the divide. And it was all parties and none. And that was the other really important thing. And, when you try to kind of report it within the party, a lot of people got pushback. A lot of people got, you better handle that in a different way. So actually, one of the recommendations that we made in the task force was, one, to have clear pathways of reporting, to have supports in place for people, because it does come back to that thing, speaking up and not allowing that person to be isolated and feeling further humiliated and isolated because they feel they're on their own or they feel they're not up to the job. And, I'm speaking a lot about feelings and perceptions and feelings of safety and security, but actually think about it for all of us. It's how we actually feel internally in ourselves that actually is really, really important and empowers us, enable us to stand up and do our job on behalf of other people. And there was one particular evidence we took from one particular member who was from a minority community. And the level of vile abuse, she was a female, but she was also from a minority community. And the level of abuse that her staff had to actually filter through was absolutely outrageous and horrendous. And to think that there are no supports in place for people like that is really, really difficult. And then, getting kind of the necessary supports in place. And if I could just use one other example, we talk about that the victim shouldn't have to bear the consequence, but the people that perpetrate the action should absolutely have to be accountable and bear the consequence. But then, as in Cara's case, trying to actually bring those, it's really good, and I know that what's happening here with the PSNI, it's really good what's happening with the police in the UK, and we had very good liaison with Westminster and with the police forces across the UK when we were doing the task force report, and likewise with Garda Síochána. But it's actually having those additional supports in place. And there's one particular case I can recall where actually, when this case did make its way to court, the judge didn't feel that the person should make a victim impact statement because they were an elected representative. So in another way, that actually undermines the person and their family members, who in this case were also abused. But so I think we have to change a lot of things, but I think there are really good changes happening. But it's how we actually, and it does start with political parties, and I think that political parties need to come together. For example, the civility pledge is another thing, how we treat each other even in parliamentary meetings. How are they conducted, and how do people conduct themselves, and the standards of behaviour that are expected. I think that's really, really important.
Great. So political parties need to take greater accountability for their representatives. And I'm just thinking, Hannah, the Jo Cox Foundation has been speaking about this and about abuse towards elected representatives since 2016. How does it make you feel that, as Nóirín is saying, in 2026, we're still being asked to normalise abuse, even when we know the tragic consequences of that?
How does it make me feel? Quite angry, but also hopeful, yes, but really kind of driving for change. And I think I'm really pleased the foundation is kind of prioritise this issue. And I think something I often say when I'm talking about these issues is, at the foundation, we work on issues of addressing violence, abuse, intimidation, harassment, not only or even primarily because of the way Jo was murdered, but because of that driving value, the values in which she lived, and that really positive vision. And I think that's really important to kind of keep that positive vision while understanding the horrific consequences. I just want to add a little more on political parties, because it's such an important part of this issue, and we have kind of similar recommendations about political parties taking accountability. More recently, we are exploring ways to kind of formalise, perhaps through legislation, political parties having to take more responsibility, because we've worked, myself and the foundation for a long time has worked across, it was really important to us that we work across the political party ideological spectrum. And in 2019, 2020, we released a model code of conduct for political parties. And a lot of the political parties have really good codes of conduct written down. But what we hear from members across the political spectrum is they're not implemented and the guidance is not provided. And often it's there's not a duty of care because they're not employers. So something we're exploring is if there should be legislation to kind of mandate having kind of minimum standards of codes of conduct and reporting procedures and guidance. And that's something we're exploring in the UK, but also this is a shared problem kind of internationally with political parties being, I need to find a better word than odd or weird, but quite in the way that they're set up, they're not particular, and there's a particular gap with candidates, and Cara, your experience points to this very well. When you're in the assembly or in parliaments, there should be more support, but there is more support because you're in a more employment system. But when you're a candidate, you're in a sort of weird,
Nobody owns you in politics, and when you're, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but when you're in PERDA, so the Northern Ireland Assembly has no obligation to support you, so you're on your own there. We're a party of 8, so we're one of the smallest parties in Northern Ireland, which means we wouldn't have the legal capacity or support that larger parties might have, and it's an absolute nightmare. You're in the deep blue sea all alone. That's exactly how it feels, and it's not dramatic, I don't think, to say that.
Yeah. One of the points to come back to kind of parliaments and innovations around supporting staff. So in the Scottish Parliament, for about a year now, they've had a social media monitoring scheme. So members of Scottish Parliament can sign up. There's a specific team within the security department of the Parliament that monitors social media so that the staff don't have, so the members and staff don't have to do it. And that has led to one conviction, and other cases, but one conviction. So it's been quite successful, and the Welsh Senate is piloting that. It is a big resource, but the impact is very. We would say the resource would matches the kind of really big impact, because we hear a lot from staff. The one quote this is from a while ago. It's from 2017, and I worry that it's still the case. It's Diane Abbott's office manager, so Diane Abbott MP, black woman MP in Westminster, and her office manager in a report in 2017 talked about she would come into the office in the morning, she'd have her porridge in one hand and troll through, look at Diane's social media account and decide which she should report, which was okay, and then not tell her, that was her to do, and she wouldn't tell Diane the extent of abuse that was coming in. And just that image of that's just a normal thing that is part of the job. And that we hear that all the time, it's part of the job, and we really don't want it to be part of the job.
Yeah, and I think this idea of social media monitoring scheme is fascinating. And I know, Cara, we were speaking previously about deepfakes as of tomorrow will be illegal.
Finally.
Finally, exactly. But just reflecting on all of your careers and linking back to social media abuse, do you think that the scale of the problem has changed radically over time, or do you think it's more the mechanisms or the means through which that misogynistic messaging is coming through? So do we think it's a clear reflection of social media, which makes us all, unfortunately, interconnected at all times, and people can hide behind keyboards? Or do we think the scale of the misogynistic content has increased irrespective of the mechanism of social media?
What an amazing question. I would say it's a number of things. I think accessibility to make deepfakes now is at the touch of a button. Notification apps, you can strip the clothes of anybody anywhere. I'll give you an example. About 2 weeks ago, someone sent a printed out photo of me at work. They had AI generated an image of me holding my tongue and wrote a handwritten letter on the back of it with really their initials. And my staff had to ring me, just as you had said about staff members are impacted as well, being we have just received the creepiest thing. And I was like, what is the intent here? Is it to unnerve me? We're watching, or what is it? I think it's the accessibility of the apps, but also fundamentally, you had said, obviously, these social media platforms profit off and sex sells, sadly. So when you create these images or create rage bait, or we've seen on the X platform, you can put girls standing at they could be at a rally for equal rights or women's rights, and you can put them in a bikini. How instantly demeaning and easily believed. And it's like a horror show in real time. And it's your life, it's your reputation. And you have to sit down and explain these things to your parents and to your employer. And I remember during the 2022 election, I had said to a male colleague, I had just got the video to my phone, immediately rang him, and I said, I need your help immediately. This is going to become something big. And they kind of sat back and were like, nobody's going to believe that. It's election cycle, come on. And I was like, you're not listening. I'm a woman. If someone made it to you, no one's going to believe it. I said, I'm a female and a young female, and that you already have to evidence your worth and that you've worked hard to get there and to be believed. And you just feel stripped of your dignity. And I think in Northern Ireland, misogyny here is genuinely so rife. It's so normalised. And when we speak with teachers each and every day, they're like, we need politicians to listen to us, because this isn't, as you had talked about, the top down or from the bottom up. It's about getting into our schools early to instill and empower and uplift our young men, to recognise women as their equals, to hear about our struggles in many ways and build that sense of empathy or sympathy. But I do think it's a matter of the accessibility of these platforms, the money that can be created off the back through rage bait and through sexual content, and sometimes the sick joy that some get out of stripping you of your dignity as well.
Yeah.
I also think there's a broader threat to democracy, because I agree with absolutely everything that Cara has said, but I also think if you interplay it with misinformation, disinformation, and the distortion of information, and and it's, as Cara has said, social media platforms. So to answer your question somewhat, Aishling, I think it's all of that, but I actually do think it has intensified greatly. I think some of it has been enabled by the speed and the anonymity provided by social media platforms, and particularly around recommender algorithms and things like that, because people that may decide that they want to hate you for some reason now actually can do it at the touch of a button from their own bedroom. And, again, to add a voice of hope to it, what we have seen, certainly in the South, and I know some have happened here in the North as well, but we have seen a number of prosecutions. And what's interesting about some of the prosecutions is, the judges, they've been prosecuted in the first place, so there are follow-up investigations, which is a real positive, as Hannah has said. But also the courts are taking it far more seriously, which I think is really, really important. But what some of those people are doing, they're people who are literally in their pyjamas in their bedroom and just decides, I don't like what he or what she, and a lot of the she happens to be overlaid then with either the grok images or some type of deep fake sexual images. And, we had an election candidate stood in the South, a female candidate, and exactly to Cara's experience, her experience was she was terrified that her 85-year-old father was going to hear from somebody in her local village that actually she was going around partaking in pornographic videos. And that was her terror. And she was terrified, how would she actually tell her father? And it just reminds me of the humanity of it. Like that was what she was concerned about, and she just stood away from the election cycle. And that's a terrible, but I will tell a funny story for Mum, because Cara reminded me of something. So you asked about over the span of our careers, but actually, Cara, you were describing how someone put a picture of you holding your tongue. I remember somebody going to all the trouble, either he hadn't got the ability to use social media, or maybe it was before it, but he actually used to go around cutting pictures of me out of the paper and actually drawing things on me and posting them in the old-fashioned post system. So I can only imagine if he either had the wherewithal for social media, or if he was still hating me so much, actually what now he could manage to do be a tsunami. So that's just a funny aside, but it's a serious aside as well, because it's something that's been happening for a very, very long time. I think it's become more intensified. I think, unfortunately, it's become far more normalised, and I certainly do think that's been enabled by social media platforms in a way that was never intended in the first place, and I do think there's a level of accountability for social media platforms as well.
And I would love to also push you on your experience, because we spoke at the beginning that you were the first ever female commissioner of An Garda Síochána, which is a wonderful achievement, but it's also a huge task to undertake and a huge amount of responsibility and added pressure, because you have to not only uphold the standards, but you also have to uphold the standards in a patriarchal institution. How did that map out for you? Did you feel an additional burden?
Tim is now laughing, because Tim is now saying, I hope everybody's brought their soup and sandwiches, because we could be here all night. We'd certainly be here till tomorrow lunchtime anyway. But I'll give you the short version of a very long story. I think it was a very real experience. And I think, yes, there's the patriarchy of the organisation, but also sometimes when we talk about misogyny, we actually talk about men. And I think it's really important to think about society broadly as regards men and women and people generally, because not everybody is ready for women in leadership. Yeah. And I'll use the word visible. I had an absolutely wonderful, very enjoyable career right up to 2011 when I was promoted Deputy Commissioner. And up to then, nobody knew I existed, insofar as I worked undercover and the whole lot, and I won't tell the big long story. But in 2011, when I was promoted Deputy, that all of a sudden my picture was in the paper, and some people were a bit amazed and enthralled and everything. Where did she come from? Like, as if I had just landed down, ready formed, just landed to take up this job. So they were somewhat disappointed and a bit amused as well when they found out that actually I'd been around for a very, very long time. The 4 decades, I was 2 when I joined the police. I want everybody to do the math. But quite seriously, I think, all of a sudden kind of been in a leadership role, it's very funny. And I do remember, and I will say this about elected representatives, we spoke about behaviours. And I will kind of close the circle with just saying this, but I will do another session on the experience. But, you know, some of the misogyny and the abuse and the abusive behaviour was actually from some women. And it's really interesting. And these were women elected representatives who I would have thought would have actually really respected the fact that actually, and would have had more empathy and maybe more understanding. And don't get me wrong, I was never looking for sympathy. I was always prepared to be held to account. But asking things about knitting and Pilates and, you know, did you have a bridesmaid at your wedding, as examples. That particular one came from a man, but the knitting and Pilates came from a woman. But, you know, so I would think that we have behavioural issues, cultural issues that need to be addressed. And that isn't to say we shouldn't hold people account, let it be an office holder or let it be another elected representative, but it should be done in a respectful, balanced way that actually really does get to the heart of accountability. So that's the short version of what I will promise is a very long story.
Thank you for sharing. And I think it gets to the heart of the problem is that there is so many additional layers of being a woman in politics, and so many additional challenges and obstacles that you have to face and overcome. And so I'm conscious of time, and I want to get our roving mic operating. But if I'm going to ask one last question off the panel and end on a positive note. And to start with Hannah, if our audience here today was to walk away with one key practical solution that they could implement in their day-to-day life to kind of target some of these issues, what would that be? And I realise I've put you massively on the spot now.
When you are contacting your elected representative and you're disagreeing with them, as you should hold them accountable. Remember, communicate with respect and tell your friends to do that as well. And, you know, robustly, but respectfully.
Yep, they're human too. Yep. Great.
And it's their staff who are reading it.
Nóirín?
I'm glad you started with Hannah, she's far more positive. No, my thing would be actually what I said at the beginning, is to be upstanders as opposed to bystanders. And I think the one thing that I would ask of everybody is, you know, think about it if this was your mother, your sister, your father, your brother. And, you know, to call out behaviours when you hear them or see them, and not to be afraid to do that, because it takes a lot of courage. And I think actually we all need to step up and be that upstander that actually calls it out. And that makes it unacceptable. And that's what starts to shift the culture and move that dial that we have moved, but we need to continue moving. And we are sisters in arms, and we have a brother in arms here, so we're good.
Go, Tim. I do feel a great sense of optimism. I would say change is coming. Like from tomorrow, deepfakes will be illegal in Northern Ireland. And I've been fighting this for 4 years. And I'm just over the moon. We've seen positive changes there, law changes. We see Ofcom stepping up when it comes to social media sites and mass blocking and regulations there, which I think is exceptional. And, you know, keep the faith. And I'm working at the minute. I spoke with the executive office officials about creating a tech toolkit. So if any person out there, it's predominantly young women and women of all ages who feel they have been deepfaked or wronged online, to gather the data of where they can go, who they can talk to, and how they can figure out how to evidence their innocence. So we're all out here doing our thing, trying our best. So I think if we keep going and work together, you know, only good can happen.
And I think that's such an important note to kind of wrap up on, is this idea that, and I'm absolutely guilty of being a negative person, but that even amongst all of these pressures and experiences with deepfakes, is that we still have the capacity to change, and that also women are at the forefront of that change as well. So an excellent positive message to end on. But we do have a very wonderful roving mic. So I would really welcome questions from the audience. So if there's any questions, yeah, we have one already.
It's not really a question, it's a statement. One way of kind of trying to stop social media being negative is if each political party had a social media manager, and the only way that I could contact my MLA or MP was through this political party site, that would create a strong barrier for any hatred, I think. So to give an example, local example, if I wanted to say something negative or horrible about Arlene Foster, but I can't contact Arlene Foster, the only way I could contact her is going through the DUP site and leaving a message for, I think, a lot of people would think twice about doing that. So I think, and you mentioned Diane Hubbard. I was horrified at what was happening to Diane Hubbard. I was practically in tears. She was persecuted and vilified, not only in social media, but by the press as well. The media were just, it was a total witch hunt. It was horrific, absolutely horrific. So that's the first point I'd like to make, that you take back control over social media by going through each political party. And the few other points that I want to make about social media. Social media is in part a platform for hatred. And unfortunately, you know, if I put something on there, it's an opinion, and I cannot stop someone believing that opinion as being fact. That's the reality of social media. That's the problem with it. And my opinion may not be true. It's probably false. It's probably a lie. So you're going from opinion to a falsehood to a lie, becoming a fact and a truth. That's the problem with social media. And one question I'd like to ask you all, do you think that we can get some sense and ban iPhones for, control the age of iPhones, that it should be 16 that they have iPhones? Because if you're going to stop this, you need to stop this. You would not let a 13-year-old go into a bar and get drunk or take drugs because it's against the law. Why are you allowing young children to be, their minds to be polluted by sex and violence in social media? It has to stop.
Which is a great question, and Australia has recently banned social media for, I believe, under 16s. And there's some conversations in the UK also about that. So do we have any reflections on?
Yeah, just very briefly, I actually brought a motion to the floor of the House about a month ago, and it passed with full success. And myself and Minister Given don't agree on much, but we agree wholeheartedly on banning phones in schools, and that under 16s, you know, your brain, your frontal lobe is not developed with decision making, and your mind is shaped by the content you consume. And you're absolutely spot on, the gentleman in the back. Sex, violence, you can even buy drugs through these social media sites. Like, you're essentially giving your child access to the world, that they take their phone to bed. You know, it's for me, it's all about child safeguarding as well. And if it was up to me tomorrow, I would ban for under 16s. And I had said in my speech, this is going to make me unbelievably hated by the youth, but it's the right thing to do, and it's important to make the right changes while we're in a position in which to do so.
Yeah. And I also think children and under 16s are reflecting themselves on the dangers of social media, and, you know, so they got the idea of stolen focus too. So it's certainly like a valid idea, and gaining momentum as well. Do we have any other questions from the audience? We'll get you a microphone, yeah.
I teach children of 6, and they're going to bed at night. Mothers are asleep. What do they have? They have the phones. So it's from a very early age, and indeed, I know somebody else that asks, what do you do with your child when they're upset? Oh, I give them the iPad now. That's not to say a 2-year-old, but they are using social media in in some way from a very early age. There's a lot of work now being done in relation to schools, in relation to media. However, I don't think we're getting to the right people. I think we need to get to parents, and it's not happening. And that's what I would like to ask the panel. How do they feel they could get, because at the end of the day, as you said, bottom up is extremely important, as indeed coming down through legislation. Delighted about tomorrow, and indeed I cancelled my X account a long time ago because of this, and indeed I rarely, only if I need to look at Facebook, if somebody sends me something, but I don't use it because both of them are, as you know, it's American, those people that are very much next to Trump, and I think we should be all taking a stand. But however, I want to ask you about the whole idea of the bottom up, and I think in relation to parents and how we get there.
I couldn't agree more, because I think all of the initiatives and all the legislation in the world, and I think it's really good what's happening here tomorrow. And Cara had mentioned earlier Julia Mangrant, who's the e-safety commissioner in Australia. And the Australians have done a lot of very good work, but I think it starts with parental responsibility. And I think your example of giving a phone as a soothing tool or instrument to a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old. And, I have a very good friend, and he's got a 6-year-old granddaughter, and he was telling me a story about he was looking after her, and he has an aquarium. And he came in, and she was doing this on the aquarium, and she said to him, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And she says, "I'm making the fish bigger, Papa." And when you think about even for that's the mindset. I think there's the issue with the mobile phones, and as you say, a 6-year-old child going to bed with a mobile phone. I know I have a grandson who's 2.5, and he actually has a mobile phone that he can play some games on. But gaming platforms as well are a real issue, and the type of soother, if you like, that people are using. There's all kinds of, BBC Kids and all that, but there's all kinds of data making its way through in some of those that are actually forming minds at that very, very young age. And just you mentioned 6-year-old children, there was a report issued yesterday in the Republic, and it was saying how 6-year-old children and that age group are being indoctrinated into crime, and how the vulnerabilities around their parents, and it's just shocking. So I really do think it comes back to parental responsibility when it comes to mobile phones. There's so much legislators can do, but actually if people are willing to give their child a screen or a mobile phone, I absolutely think that. And I absolutely have great empathy with teachers, female teachers particularly, but also male teachers, because the conduct and the behaviour, and we talk about culture and we talk about standards of behaviour in classrooms, it's just appalling when you speak to young people that are actually trying to manage classrooms of boys and girls. And from junior school, it's not just in secondary school. So I do think there's something about setting the tone at home, and that isn't to put an additional burden on parents, but I do think we actually, again, a collective thing, because the peer pressure with children themselves, because Hannah has a lovely iPhone and I only have something that can only get whatever. I think that's real peer pressure, and I think that we do have to start standing up against that as well.
And it's an excellent question. And I was at a conference on Monday for ending violence against women and girls, and at it was a social service worker, and she works in harmful sexual behaviour in kids. And she said that the number one predictor of safe sexual behaviour is for the child to have a trusted adult that they can have open and honest conversations around sex, relationships, and all of these issues, and that if they don't have that trusted adult, then they're going online, and as we've spoken about, misogyny and violence are profitable online as well. So an excellent question. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yeah, the lady. Oh, sorry, we've got two. We've got one and then two. Lovely.
Hi. Sorry. My question was just around, I'm really passionate about politics. I go to a lot of different talks like this. I love listening to female politicians and people that work in the sector. I think that something that I've heard more and more from a wide range of voices is they start off kind of in their career, they would always kind of talk to younger women, just women in general, looking to get into politics, and they kind of, the narrative that they've said has really changed over the past few years. They've gone from being enthusiastic and saying, absolutely yes, please do get involved, to a bit more cautious, to some of them have started to kind of say, I wouldn't recommend it. So I was just wondering what you would potentially say to women that you talk to in those kind of scenarios, and if you would still kind of have that enthusiastic yes, or is it a bit more qualified these days with a bit of a caveat as well?
Great question. I'm happy to go as well. Do you go first?
I can give the broader, I think it's a really good question. It's definitely something that we have kind of seen over the years, and we at the Jo Cox Foundation work with politicians across the political spectrum of all genders, and we work a lot with other civil society organisations. And something particularly the women in democracy sector say to us is, and we talk about how we need to be really, it's a balance, I guess, is what I think it's important to say the really good aspects of the job, and that it remains really important kind of on a macro level to have representation, and on an individual level it can be really fulfilling. You can make a lot of change, and there is potentially there are risks entering this environment. And I think that kind of honest balance is really important. And that is one of the reasons why we want to keep working on it. And I mentioned the women democracy sector, who do a lot of training with women, and a lot of their curriculum has changed. It used to be a lot more about personal resilience, and now it's a lot more about we're trying to make structural change. And when you enter politics, we encourage you to make structural change because you have to. So also the job is perhaps changing. And maybe, Cara, you can reflect on that a bit more.
Spot on. Your question is speaking my language. I was actually talking about this briefly before we began tonight, because I first got into politics at 23. I'm now 30. And from the moment I stepped in, I was like to my friends, oh my God, you can do this too. We can do this. But gradually over time, particularly for things that have happened to me, whether it's real life harms or online harms, because you get threats to your house too about different things, I've thought, this is actually cowardly of me, because what I am doing is inviting these young, passionate ladies, who I was once, into the lion's den, essentially, and you have no protection mechanisms. So I thought, I cannot invite women into this space of all ages without actively doing something to try and make it a safe space for them, and to bridge the gaps and fill the gaps where there's absolutely no support. Because even though you're in what is perceived as a position of power, the powerlessness is overwhelming. You're actually, you feel very much on your own. So the way that I try and, I suppose, rectify this in my head is, as long as I'm doing something to make it a safe space, I'll continue to advocate for women and to invite them into it. But yeah, very hard. And when you speak, it's really interesting actually, when you go to speak with young women about getting them into politics, 9 times out of 10, a man will say, yep. But when you ask a woman, I always say ask 3 times, because on the 3rd time, you give them enough self-belief, and 50-50 NI is here tonight, and they do exceptional work on trying to get a gender-balanced representation in politics here. And I think it's upon each and every one of us as females and males, which is great why Tim has us here tonight, to talk, to make sure we're doing our bit to, keep the door open for the new generation coming in and making sure we're as gender-balanced as possible.
Just add a positive note to that, because I think it's a really important question. But when we were actually producing the report of the task force, one of the things that we were very mindful of, we don't want to, so the local elections were coming up and the European elections, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't in some way deterring people from going for politics, and particularly young women. And actually, in the local and the European elections, there was the biggest number of women candidates ever come forward. And I would very much give credit for that to the women's caucuses, because actually they've done a lot of work, including media literacy, digital literacy, but also providing supports. And, knowing that actually these are some of the things you have to deal with, but knowing that there are tools in the toolkit to deal with them is really, really important. And also that there are support structures in place. So I think that's just a positive thing. Women are still coming forward in number.
Yeah, and I think, for all the challenges there are, I always like to say we exist, right? And this room exists, and we all have the capacity for change as well. So we can overcome those challenges too. And so our last question of the night, no pressure.
No pressure. Can I just say, in relation to it, often the struggle that we have in terms of, because the panellists were very good, is it seems to be, or it's painted as it's a woman's problem and it's a woman needs to fix it. I'm going to ask the age-old question, how do we get men to be leading on this, to be challenging men in relation to their behaviour and all of that comes with it? Because sometimes, as I said, because I work with the trade union NIPS, I'd say sometimes it feels when you're talking to men, it's what I call it the Charlie Brown voice. All they hear is, they don't actually hear the voice and what's being said. But what we actually need is the allyship of men to actually stand up and call out their colleagues, call out their counterparts, and call out, regardless of whether you have a family member who you think might be affected, it's what's right and what's proper, and how do we go about doing that?
That is an excellent question. How do we get our male allies on board?
I go back to the home and the community. I think it really starts there. And I do think actually, I have 3 sons and a husband who happens to be here, so I have to be very careful what I say about men. But not all men are bad. And I think that's something we have to be very careful about as well. There's good men, and there's good men who support women. And I think that is really, really important to remember. And I do think it's back to the question about the behaviours that we instill. And that's why I really think schools and communities are so important. So important for societal values, for social values, for attitudes towards women and girls, for attitudes towards each other. And I think it's back to that core thing of respect, of standing up for each other. And I do think respect and valuing people and that humanity is something. So I actually think it starts in the home and permeates all the way up to, I think education has a huge role to play, absolutely huge. And, you know, again, those standards of behaviour in classrooms all the way through the school system. You know, Tim gave a very good example of when he started here in Queen's, you know, what was the attitudes like? And I think those attitudes and behaviours, they're the things that will actually change culture. And I do think it starts, and again, I hate putting pressure and saying it starts in the home, but that's where values start. You know, and I think that's something that we have to kind of build on and reinforce through the education system.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I also think it's really important to make clear that gender equality is really good for men. Like, that's better for men. Like, harmful gender norms, and we're seeing much more research on this, which I think is really positive. Harmful gender norms are really, really awful for men. And if we have a democracy, society in which care is really valued, that is good for everyone. So I think it's not, I think that's what's really important, is pointing out the disproportionate abuse and so on that women get, and the kind of positive vision of a more equal, robust debate, society, politics is good for everyone. And something I was thinking with Nóirín as you were talking, because we were at the UN at the same time. I was much more junior than Nóirín, but working on...
It was very important.
Well, I was part of a very small team at UN Women working on implementing the gender parity strategy across the UN system, and the Department of Safety and Security did an amazing job, partly because I was mostly men. But one of the messages that that department and what we really try to do was say that it is good to have women in leadership because that is more representative of the world, and the United Nations is supposed to represent the world. So this is a really good thing for everyone. And I think that messaging is really important, that this is not about, it's about supporting women in order to support everyone and support a more equal representative democracy in society.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think it's absolutely right. A fantastic question. It's all about the community setting as well. Recently at the Education Committee, they had talked about youth funding, and it's in real danger, and coming up to June, we won't know what the budget's going to look like. It's actually in those relaxed settings our young fellas can speak up about how they're feeling. And for many young children, particularly young boys, they don't have that male role model that they can, you know, understand what healthy masculinity looks like. And I really think it's all about the schools, the education and the community youth settings, because finding an adult you can trust to kind of tease out, maybe you do have a handful of misogynistic beliefs, and once you kind of talk it out, you know, boys want to be good men, but they need the male role models to become what they want to be. So I really think community and youth investment is absolutely key. And also, I just call out cowardice as well. If I see one of our male reps hasn't spoken about a woman's issue, or doesn't want to talk about period poverty, or, you know, feels uncomfortable talking about sexual assault, I say, no, you need to get in there and you need to raise your head above the parapet and get involved. And I always say, you know, a lot of male representatives have daughters, so we need to get them to speak up and speak out. And even, like, I was speaking with a group, just to finish on this point because it will keep everyone here all night, but I was chatting with a group of young people today in Stormont, and one of the key things they came back with was the school uniform bill. It was initially in there for girls to be allowed to wear trousers, because ultimately Stormont is based on the concept of equality. Now, this wasn't put through, and at the movement of a pen, the minister could put it through, but he chose not to. And I just thought there was a great irony that we talk about ending violence against women and girls, but this high-ranking male with so much power and can do the right thing chose not to, and is telling young girls what they can or can't wear. So I think it's really ironic we're talking about gender-based violence on one hand, but controlling what young women wear. So I think from an institutional perspective, we need to do better politically, and then at that youth level, making sure the investment is in our youth clubs, in our communities, and lifting up our young boys as well, because we don't always need to tell them off. It's about challenging their beliefs, empowering them to think differently. I think that's what will make the change. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a wonderful way to wrap up about the importance of compassion and kindness, which is reflective of the Jo Cox Foundation. And unfortunately, we operate in a society that crushes compassion and empathy and kindness from our young boys. So to build on Nóirín's point, it's really important to enforce the power and the value of those things, and to kind of dispel this notion that somehow through kindness you're weaker. So I think that's a wonderful way to finish up. So all that's left for me to do is to thank everyone. And my notes say for frank and honest conversations, but I think it's more positive conversations this evening. And as promised, if you've been affected by any of the issues discussed, there are a number of useful contacts such as Nexus NI, Samaritans NI, Victim Support, Women's Aid Belfast and Lisburn, Men's Advisory Project. And if you're not affected by any of those issues, they are all wonderful charities also to support. And linked to that, I need to also thank the John and Pat Hume Foundation and the Jo Cox Foundation for facilitating this conversation as part of Imagine Festival. Most importantly, thank you to the audience as well for your insightful questions and your contributions. And then finally, and most importantly, a massive thank you for our wonderful panelists, not only for joining us today, but also being at the front line of pushing back against social media abuse and against women in politics. So one last round of applause.
Can I just also, on behalf of the John and Pat Hume Foundation, kind of thank everybody for attending. And also, one of the reasons the foundation was set up, not only to reflect on the role of John and Pat Hume in terms of peacemaking, but it's all about inspiring future leaders in peaceful change making. And what a remarkable panel tonight. And the chairing as well, Aishling, was brilliant. I just wish, maybe we can talk about it later on, if we had a roadshow around colleges and schools to listen to the inspirational words and commitments from all of the speakers.